Hello, good evening. Guten Abend. Good to see you all. Bob Fowler here. Week 2 of 2 on the new Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Most of the time tonight I'd like to spend looking with you. I've cherry-picked some passages to look at, and I propose to sprint through those, understanding that we may pause and discuss them at some length. But to review, last week we talked about this new translation, which is NRSVue, goes back to the NRSV of 1989, and I'm sure Trinity Cathedral embraced it quickly. That was before my time here, but the previous translation, the NRSV, has been around 35 years, so that's long enough to suggest a review might be in order. And indeed, they have produced quite a revision. Mostly minor things, but of some significance nevertheless. This was produced by the National Council of Churches, which holds the copyright to the RSV, NRSV, and now the NRSVue, National Council of Churches, and this time, for the first time ever, the Society of Biblical Literature, surely the leading academic society for biblical scholars in the Americas for sure, and it's even international in sweep. So National Council of Churches, the Society of Biblical Literature. I have the SBL Study Bible here. You're welcome to look at it afterward. It's a monstrous thing, 2,000 pages. I can't wait for it to become available in my Bible software, but so far it's only in print, at least it's, but on Kindle apparently. I'll need to check that out. So last week we talked a little bit about why do new translations in the first place. Basically two major reasons. One is that our understanding of the ancient text changes, it mutates. And then on the other hand, our own culture and language, the way we would put into words in our time and place, the understandings of people long ago, that also is constantly mutating. So we'll see that as we look at the passages in which there are some interesting updates in the latest version. Any questions, comments so far? Last week I told you a bit of a story about my discovery of Edgar Goodspeed and his publication on the translator's preface to the King James Bible, which was a revelation for me since it happened in a library in South Dakota. And Edgar Goodspeed was a University of Chicago professor, and I had just been at the University of Chicago for a number of years, but I had to go to South Dakota to discover this publication. And this was his defense of the translator's preface to the King James Bible, which almost no one knows anything about because it hasn't been published along with the text of the King James Bible since the early 1800s. So this was a revelation to me to learn about this translator's preface, long ignored. And so I told that story. This week I want to tell another story, and that relates to the chart of the English Bible that the American Bible Society produced, which is no longer readily available unless you see me for a PDF scan of it, which I did. Fortunately, I did a number of years ago. I want to zero in on the immediate family history of the NRSVue. It's really the King James legacy. King James Bible 1611. Thank your lucky stars or God in heaven that I'm not inflicting this whole thing on you. Because I used to do a 15-week course on the history of the Bible. And so this will be short and sweet in comparison to 15 weeks of tedium. Or I'm sure some students enjoyed it. I certainly did. So we'll pick up with King James 1611, the third authorized version. Not the first, not the second, but the third. And authorized means the king okayed it. It does not mean God wrote it, threw it over the edge of a cloud, and someone down below caught it. No, 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 no. Authorized has to do with royal monarchical approval. And we're not so much in that business anymore, although getting the news daily, you wonder if we're headed to monarchy. I hope not.
Was the NRSV approved by the Crown? I thought that was strictly American.
RSV? Oh, no, the King James Bible is the third and final authorized.
Oh, that was the third, okay.
King James, if I misspoke, sorry, but King James was the third and final authorized version. And actually, there's no documentation of the authorized status of the King James, but I think there was a fire and records were burned, or maybe someone just forgot to get King James to rubber stamp it. We know he got the whole thing started in 1604, so it took them 7 years to produce the thing. 54 scholars to begin with, 47 finished, probably because of retirement as well as death. So anyway, King James Bible 1611. Then in the 1800s, enough new stuff had been discovered by then. Hundreds, if not thousands, of ancient manuscripts had been discovered, and people began to take them very, very seriously. And so the English Revised Version was published in the late 1800s, and then an American version of the very same thing was produced in 1901, the American Standard Version. Basically, the American Standard Version is the British version, but with American spellings of words. And I think I'd like to hunker down and deal with that a bit, just a tiny bit, to give you a sample of how new insights into ancient texts can lead to an urgency to update, revise our translations. Through the 1800s in particular, there were a number of significant manuscript discoveries. And the two that really jump out at me, and in fact jump out at a lot of New Testament scholars, there were two 4th century codices of the entire Bible in Greek, Old Testament, Apocrypha, New Testament. There were two huge codices of the entire Bible, and that's very, very rare. Usually you get a copy of Mark, one of the letters of Paul. You tend to get individual books of the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible. But in the 4th century, because there had to be some significant backing from someone to produce these monstrous single volume texts, there were two of these that have survived and came to light in the 1800s. And lo and behold, for me and for many, many biblical scholars, it's particularly interesting and important that these two manuscripts, one is called Sinaiticus because it was found at the foot of Mount Sinai in St. Catherine's Monastery, and the other is called Vaticanus because it's sitting in the Vatican Library. So Vaticanus in Rome today, Sinaiticus is in London today. Both of them have long, interesting stories, which we do not have time to go into. But both of these manuscripts, 4th century. 4th century sounds like it's a long ways beyond Jesus and Paul and early Christianity, but actually those are among the earliest manuscripts that we have of particularly the Greek New Testament in any form at all. We do have some isolated manuscripts that are a little bit older than that, but not many. But these two huge 4th century productions are interesting because they seemed to drop out here and there a lot of passages that had worked their way into copies of the Bible over centuries and centuries and centuries. And that's typically what happens when scribes are copying by hand everything. They tend to add more than they subtract. So in general, there's a rule of thumb. If you're looking at a few dozen or a few hundred manuscripts, and they don't all say the same thing, because they never do. No two ancient manuscripts are alike. No two are alike. Difference, 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 difference. You got to learn to live with difference if you want to take the Bible seriously. Remind you of life, any? Fixed, enforced, authoritarian unity, oneness. I run away from it as fast as I can. It's not reality. It's wishful thinking maybe, but not reality. So Sinaiticus and Vaticanus both lacked interesting passages, and in particular 50 years ago, April I think it was, so we passed the anniversary. 50 years ago I was defending my master's thesis at the University of Kansas on the ending of the Gospel of Mark. And we could spend a few years talking about that if you like. The Gospel of Mark in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus end abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8. The women, I've got it here actually. The three women, in Mark there are three women, not one as in John, not two as in Matthew, not five or more as in Luke. In Mark there are three. They went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to no one. It's a double negative in Greek. They said nothing to no one, for they were afraid. End of story. Jesus never reappears. The Great Commission doesn't happen. All the stuff you know and love from Matthew, Luke, and John, it's not there in Mark. So, but that's probably the original. That's probably where it all started, and Sinaiticus and Vaticanus would suggest that. So what happened? Well, scribes, particularly once you had not one gospel, Mark, the earliest. That was Mark's vulnerability. He was the earliest, therefore he could be fiddled with by everyone who copied him. And when people began to copy him, they began to fill it out from what they had picked up from the other gospels. And so if you open any Bible today, chances are you'll see extra verses at the end, but in maybe double brackets, double square brackets, or in a footnote or something. So back in the 70s, when I was wrestling with the question of the ending of Mark, the jury was still out. There was still a lot of argument. I think it would be safe to say that people were tending toward accepting the shorter, more abrupt, more mysterious ending. And for crying out loud, it is mysterious. No one saw risen Jesus. The women are scared to death. They don't say nothing to no one. What a way to end the gospel. Well, it's tricky to make that work on Easter Sunday. It's possible.
Bob, I'm just going to pass around the NRSVue that I have here that shows the little brackets at the end, just so people can take a look while they're listening.
That's been a common practice for decades and decades now. But back in the 70s, it was still pretty much up for grabs. And I'm glad that I made the right decision to defend those two codices, those two manuscript Bibles in their use of the short version of Mark. And on your own, we can't do it tonight, but on your own, I'd warmly invite you to work your way through the extra verses that were added on later, and those extra verses, 12 of them, chapter 16, verse 9 through 20, those extra add-on verses are found in the vast, vast majority of manuscripts. So majority doesn't win in the game of critically assessing ancient manuscripts.
Are there two alternative endings that they put on?
Oh, the question is, are there two alternate endings? And yes, and more. There are two major endings. One is very, 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 very short, and our new translation puts in a header the intermediate ending of Mark, and it's so short I could read it quickly. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. After the real ending says, they said nothing, no one. Then this add-on ending says, and he told, and all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Amen. So that wraps things up a bit, and at least gets the word of the resurrection told, and the Great Commission briefly hinted at. But then comes, in other manuscripts, in most manuscripts, then there are these 12 verses, which is called here the long ending of Mark. So this long ending, chapter 16, verse 9 through 20, if you want to do some homework on your own, read through that and force yourself to find the echoes of the other Gospels, because that's what this is. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny Reader's Digest condensed version of the endings of Matthew, Luke, and John. So clearly, it seems so obvious now 50 years later, and I was intuiting that this was the case 50 years ago. But it seems pretty clear, pretty obvious at this late date in history that whatever scribe first came up with this brilliant add-on was inspired by what he or she, probably he, saw in the other gospel endings and pulled out bits and pieces from that. So Mary Magdalene goes solo to the tomb in this long extra ending. And then there's a one line, no, actually two verse allusion to the road to Emmaus, Luke 24. And then we get a fairly decent summary, boiled down version of the Great Commission. That would be Matthew 28. And then we get a tiny, tiny bit of Jesus ascending to heaven. And if I may upset the apple cart by mentioning what Luke does with the ascension, he tells the story twice. Once at the ending of the Gospel of Luke. I hope I said Luke. Luke. Yes, Luke. Luke refers to the ascension at the very end of the Gospel of Luke. Then, of course, he refers to it again at the beginning of the book of Acts. But as best I can tell, the Gospel allusion to the ascension happens on Easter Sunday. And the ascension into heaven in Acts is later. Later.
So I have a question
Yes.
about the NRSVue. So is there something helpful that the NRSVue is doing here that we haven't seen in the previous NRSV? Do you like making it clearer what's happening at the
I
end
don't
here?
think there's much, with regard to the ending of Mark, I don't think there's much change at all. I did not notice any. I'll confess what I confessed last week, and that is that the Gospel of Mark is the only the only book in the NRSVue that I've read through completely and actually put in parallel columns. And I don't recall, I'm not going to look at all 25 pages. I don't recall any significant changes at all in that. And actually, through the Gospel of Mark, I didn't see any big changes much anywhere. I don't think we've had significant manuscript discoveries for the New Testament in the last 35 years. But what has come about, and we talked a tiny bit about this last week, what has come about in the last 35 years is that more and more and more of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which contain books of the Hebrew Bible, that has really come out with a vengeance in the last 35, 40 years. So I'm not a Hebrew Bible scholar, and I did not go looking for passages in the Old Testament that or the text has changed because of new insights from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I did see references to that in some of the literature I collected that's available online, and it's in the bibliography that I offered you in one of these handouts. So not a lot of textual revolutions or revelations on the New Testament side in the last 35 years, but I know there have been some changes of note over on the Hebrew Bible side. So, but I like to zero in on this business from the 1800s, Vaticanus Sinaiticus, because it's really interesting and significant. These remain probably the two most influential, revered, respected ancient texts of the entire Bible in Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. But on the New Testament side, these 4th century manuscripts are really among the earliest that we have, and they're probably the most accurate that we have because of the tendency of scribes to add stuff as time goes by.
Might those codices been put together because it was about 4th century that they finally agreed on what were going to be the canonical books of the New Testament?
I think that's the question is, were these done in the 4th century because the canonization process was nearing the end? I'm not so confident of that because it seems to me the canonization process was just beginning to wrap up. Because the very first, if I can remember, the very first time the 27 books of the New Testament are ever listed, named precisely by anyone, is Athanasius in 369, his 39th festal letter. But by 4th century, that's as sharp as scholars are willing to go. So the canonization process is still groping its way forward when these were done. These might have been done to urge that along, but we don't know when, where, how, by whom they were done. It's just one of those vacuums in our knowledge. Shall we look at changes? Finally. Where's my, I put aside my handout. Let's look at some changes. Any questions so far? Any other?
The last pages.
Yeah, the last 2 pages of this monster 7-page handout. Let's see if we can sprint these changes, these blessed changes. There were 1 or 2 others on the other handout. Did anyone take the handout home and look at, from the first of the handouts, Pastor Hucks in 1952 ripping out and burning pages of the RSV because Isaiah 7:14, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. That's what the King James says, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. RSV changes that to young woman, and that got people up in arms, and so they started burning Bibles, because how dare they change what the King James says. Well, it's even more interesting than that. Over time, it's now the young woman is present tense with child and shall bear a son. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I have studied some Hebrew, and I think that is fair and accurate. So it's very, very controversial, though, or at least was once upon a time. And people like to burn things or burn people when Bible translation is involved. Wycliffe had his body burned up, unburied, dug up, and then burned whatever was left of it after 44 years in the grave. And then William Tyndale in 1536 is strangled. They did him a favor by strangling him before burning his body. So if you need to have your body burned, I recommend being strangled first, because less pain. So apparently there's a lot of fire involved in Bible translation. Mark 1:1 is Son of God in the original text or not. Manuscripts vary. I kind of think, I didn't verify this, but I kind of think Vaticanus and Sinaiticus both leave out the designation, the Son of God. They have Jesus Christ, but they may not have Son of God. At least one of them I know leaves it out, which makes scholars suspicious of it. It's so easy for a scribe to add things, and so that's what was done regularly. So I don't have a super strong opinion on that myself, but it's typical of the kind of variation that did happen. One of those two readings is more likely to be original than they can't both be original, can they? Two different readings can't both be the one and only original. So fishermen to fishers, let's drop out the gender indication there. A fisher is a fisher is a fisher, regardless of his, her, their gender identity. So I think that's all that is. The next one is really quite significant, quite important, I think. In Mark 1:40 and 42, leper becomes a man with a skin disease, and leprosy becomes skin disease. What do I know about leprosy? I know it's called Hansen's disease now. If you have the real thing, if you have what, an official medical diagnosis, and the feeling among scholars is we're not talking necessarily about Hansen's disease, but we're talking about some sort of skin disease, skin ailment. There might be as many as 40 or 50 skin diseases that could easily have been called leprosy 2,000 years ago. So, but I'm not expert in ancient skin diseases. I've had a couple of skin cancers, but that doesn't count. That doesn't count. But the interesting thing, the important thing, if you leap ahead to the next page, to Matthew 4:24, here's really the thing that matters. In the NRSV, Matthew 4:24, they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. The New Translation has decided not to saddle people with those characterizations their whole life. I've always wondered, before this translation ever came along, I always wondered, is a demoniac who has had the demon exorcised still a demoniac? Maybe an ex-demoniac, but no longer a demoniac, presumably. Well, the NRSVue wants to cut through that and say, you got a demon, you got a demon, but let's not saddle people with labels that kind of are applied mindlessly without identifying the person with the particular problem. So that's what they're trying to get away from, and that's what the leper reference back in Mark 1 was about. To have a challenge, to have some sort of affliction, but it's another thing to be saddled with that label forever and ever, particularly if you've moved beyond it. So it's trying to improve the translation, trying to.
Is that true of every revision?
Excuse me?
Is that the goal of every revision, just to make it more contemporary?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
The question is that the goal of all of the revisions here, just to make it more contemporary?
In large part, that's what's going on a great deal of the time. Not,
Contemporary or political correctness.
well, no.
I think it's the modern way that people speak is part, that, translating is to translate it for the contemporary culture.
We lose what we were studying these people at that time.
Yes, I understand. I think the same thing is done in other translations too, though. We're translating it based on cultural understandings of that time.
Was that changed at the historical document?
This is why preachers should know their Greek and Hebrew. They need to go into the detail as to what's happening. I wanted to
Amen.
point out
Amen.
one other example that I appreciate in here. I went to go check Mark 5, and instead of the subheading, the woman with the issue of blood, it says, a girl restored to life and a woman healed. And that, some of these, I usually skip over
And
all
that's
the
a
headings.
that's a heading.
That's a heading.
That's
yeah.
another thing
They
I haven't
changed
even
the
addressed.
headings to help.
The headings ain't in the original text, so don't bet on headings. Just like if I do something on the parable someday, one of the bits of advice I'll give is don't run with the given familiar title of any parable, because that you probably won't see the full depth of the parable if you simply go by the prodigal son, the rich man and Lazarus.
What I wanted to say about this, though, is that I appreciate it. I appreciate the change of recognition as to tell the story of what happens at the end of the story versus the beginning of the story,
Yeah.
because these are shorthand for people that are flipping through scripture. I remember if I were to think of, what's in Mark 5? Oh yeah, that's the woman with the issue of blood, because that's what the title
Yeah.
always called her.
Yeah.
But now it's a woman healed. So I think it's just a different way of helping us understand what happens in the story too.
Yeah.
More generous.
Sometimes it's simply a better understanding of the original language. On the one hand, we got to express things in our own language with our own perspectives, but sometimes it's simply that these translators have been more faithful to the original. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him, we all know that Judas was betrayed him, that it's betrayal, but the Greek word is to hand over, and there's no necessary implication in to hand over that it was betrayal. Now, it was betrayal, there was no doubt about that, but that's not what the word says. So they have gone back and done a better job, I think, of translating the original. Same thing with Mark 9:22. Instead of pity, compassion. Compassion is the more common English translation of the word. And so they're fine-tuning old traditional English translations of these words. Or pay taxes to the emperor, pay taxes to Caesar. The word in Greek is Caesar. Caesar. It's not the word for emperor, it's Caesar. And so they have reverted to the original Greek. That's not a translation, that's a transliteration. They simply have restated in English the word that's there in Greek. Now back to sensitivity to status and one's personal characteristics, servant girl. They've put language like that aside because they think it's maybe unconsciously, naively demeaning to refer to a female servant as a servant girl. Now, in fact, she may be a girl. And I look that up, and I kind of think the person is young, but they're consistently doing things like that. One or two other. So how are we doing?
I would like to make one comment about that, changing pay taxes to the emperor to pay taxes to Caesar. For me personally, that puts a slightly different construction on it. It grounds it more firmly in the politics of the time.
Oh, yeah. I wish we had time to go down that route. I'm a big fan of a New Testament scholar named John Dominic Crossan, and he's just published his most recent book, probably his 25th or 30th book. This one's on Paul the Pharisee, and I've got it on order from Amazon, so it's going to show up, and I ought to read it. Crossan has convinced me long ago that a lot of the terms that are used to praise Jesus, like Son of God, God, so on, down the list we go, were prior to Jesus terms used to honor Caesar. And so when you start calling, Kyrios, Lord, who was Lord of the Roman Empire? The guy sitting on the throne in Rome. That's the Kyrios. So if some Galilean peasant comes along and is called Kyrios, watch out if you want to follow that Kyrios instead. There's a reason why Jesus, Peter, Paul, and others are killed by Rome. Certainly, I got to touch on this. Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and you talk like one. I had to look that up because I knew that was from one of the other Gospels. That's Matthew. Now, whether someone has grabbed that from Matthew and stuck it in here into the text of Mark, I don't know. Or maybe it was in both Matthew and Mark, but someone dropped it out of Mark. That doesn't happen often, but it's not impossible. So, interesting. Golgotha, place of the skull, capitalized. They're following standard English practice, capitalizing proper nouns. If it's a proper noun, let's capitalize it. And somewhere else, Passover. They used to put Passover in lowercase letters. Now they capitalize it out of respect to Jewish tradition, Jewish practice. I'm sorry my wife isn't here, she who aspired to ministerial work. The women, like the women in Mark 15, they ministered. The Greek verb is diakoneo, from which we get deacon. Gotta offer a footnote here, gotta chime in, go down another path. There are two places in the Gospels that just haunt the heck out of me about the role of women. One is in Mark 15. This is towards the end. This is the women observing the crucifixion. We're almost to the end. And it says there that there were these women who used to follow Jesus all over the place. They were always with him. Well, that's very interesting. Why didn't we hear that before the end of the next to the last chapter in the gospel? Where were these women when it was Jesus and the boys? They never get mentioned until now, and now they're rather instrumental in how the final verses play out. Something similar happens in Luke chapter 8, the very beginning. It talks about all the women who followed along and in fact supported Jesus. They ministered, they provided financial backing for him and the boys. So that's Luke chapter 8. Why don't we get any description of that through the rest of Luke or through the Acts of the Apostles? Luke often gets a lot of credit for women, the frequency with which he includes female characters. But, other than Luke 8, well, not even there. I was going to say, too bad he doesn't describe women in leadership roles. He doesn't do that. He refers in Luke 8 to women who followed along with Jesus and supported him and so on. But there are never any women in leadership roles. If you did my Paul class a year ago, you would have heard me expound on Phoebe, the deacon in Romans 16, and a few verses later, Junia, the apostle, a woman apostle who was not of the 12, but neither was Paul. Complications. Shall we turn to sex?
Yeah, because this has received a lot of attention about the new NRSVU translation
Yeah.
from more conservative groups.
Oh,
We always like to end with sex.
Adrian, if some of that stuff is handy for you, if you could send me references to it, I'd be very interested. And I have not, forgive me, I have not read the conservative responses. I can imagine. What I've read is the academic scholarly discussion, which I tend to trust the most. Me being among that crowd, I guess. Maybe I'm prejudiced, but I'll defend academic, scholarly approaches to things. We talked a little bit about this last time. Temple prostitute, it occurs 8 times in the Old Testament, and both men and women on occasion are referred to. And the New Translation turns that into not temple prostitution, but serving in an illicit shrine. That is, maybe worshiping in a temple, but not the right way, and maybe not even to the right God. So they think they have new insight, new understanding. And I can add a little tiny footnote to that did not get mentioned last week, and that is that there are 2 major impetuses, encouragements to make this change. And one is there's been some serious scholarship that has suggested that the business about temple prostitution goes back to the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. Herodotus liked to talk about those strange foreign people who did naughty things, including temple prostitution. The scholars who've studied that in the last few decades have finally decided that he was all wet. He didn't know what he was talking about. It's indefensible. And then in addition to that, they point out that modern scholars have tended to play along somewhat blindly, naively with Herodotus. And they attribute that to Western colonialist or imperialist inclinations, a willingness to look down our noses at foreign peoples long ago and far away. So it's a tangle for sure, a combination of modern Western European hubris combined with willing to swallow strange things that a Greek historian 2,500 years ago had to say. So there are reasons why they have abandoned the business about temple prostitution. More simply, wise men has become magi because that's what the Greek word is. So, and we've already looked at Matthew 4. Last time we talked a bit about brothers, and that's worth repeating. Since I know we're coming up to a study of Acts, I've been flipping back and forth in the book of Acts to see how Luke handles gender, and it's complicated. On the one hand, he refers a number of times to settings in which there are explicitly men and women present. like in Jerusalem, the day of Pentecost, like 120 people there, men and women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus. And last I heard, she was female. So there are references to men and women together. And then in the next few words after the day of Pentecost, setting of the scene, Peter gets up and says, Andres Adelphoi, men, brothers, two thoroughly masculine nouns, men, brothers. But there are women there. Well, Luke does this a lot. And routinely he uses the Greek word adelphos, singular, or adelphoi, plural, brother, literally brother, but clearly it doesn't always mean men only. Women are people too. I learned inclusive language to begin with 50 years ago in grad school, and it really hadn't dawned on me, grade school, high school, or even as an undergraduate, that women needed to be fully and completely acknowledged in our language. So all of this time later, we're still struggling with inclusive language to try to figure out how to be respectful and appreciative of people in their diversity and so on. And particularly, well, we could go on and list all the ways we need to be inclusive rather than exclusive. But for sure, the gospel, the book of Acts in particular, ties you up in a knot, using masculine language in settings where there are clearly women present. The other passage that really jumped out at me, Paul encounters a woman named Lydia in his missionary travels, and he speaks to her house, her household, the woman's household, and he begins by saying, brothers, well, what about the lady who's hosting you, dude? But Luke wasn't as sophisticated as I am in using inclusive language. But maybe, in talking about Adelphoi, brothers, he meant Adelphoi and Adelphi, brothers and sisters. Maybe. Maybe we need to, wrestle with the whole kit and caboodle, what the ancients were thinking, how they expressed it, how we would put it today, and how we move from their time and place to our time and place.
I also think that Scripture isn't just a historical document, it's a living document as well. So I like the point of it is
Lots of evidence
to
for that.
share the good news with people. And so if there's barriers to that, I mean, Paul talks about becoming who he needs to be in order for people to hear the gospel. So I hear some of that in this style of translating Scripture so that it can be heard and received. The good news can be heard and received.
Well, I would agree 1,000% that Scripture is evolving, mutating. I mean, all the evidence says that. No two manuscripts were ever the same. And translation, once that gets rolling, that never ends. I mean, this is just a bare summary of the full complexity. So it's rich. That's why we need to study and think. Should wrap up with. Do I really want to end with this? Why not?
Yeah, with sex.
1 Corinthians 6.
Yeah, you totally should.
Yeah, I don't know.
And can I just lead in with some of the critique that has come from certain groups like the Gospel Coalition of the NRSVue is that it has removed homosexuality from this translation, and it's like the word itself.
Yeah.
And
Well.
Yeah. So there's when the words are muddy, it's the literal translations seem to be trying to bring out.
Yeah. Fair enough. That's good. And I hope you have all seen, or if you haven't, check it out, the movie 1946,
Yeah.
where the word homosexual gets inserted into modern English translation for the first time. And of course, the word homosexual was only invented in the late 1800s. So, and if anyone's interested, I printed out pages from two of my favorite scholars dealing with such things.
I've got one too.
John Boswell. Are you a John Boswell student? And then Dale Martin. This passage from Dale Martin was crucial for me in 1 Corinthians 6, because he deals with the two problematic words. I think male prostitutes, is that malakos?
Yeah.
And the other was arsenokoites. He does a wonderful job of making the case that we don't really understand what those words were saying. And mostly, to oversimplify, we have tended for 2,000 years to impose on words like that our preconceived ideas of what they ought to mean. And it's really mind-blowing. I need to reread that. If anyone's interested in this, I have a 20-page PDF. It's thick, very thick, because he was a top-notch New Testament scholar and really knew his stuff. But malakos means technically, literally soft, and it's often translated or understood to be effeminate. But don't assume that our understanding of effeminacy or softness or whatever was the ancient understanding. And he makes quite a powerful case that malakos could describe a male who pretties himself up, gets all fancy dressed and so on, so he can look for female sexual partners.
Amy Jo Levine has a great recent article too. She's a rabbi and biblical professor, and she says that there's some historical references to where it could be a man who has soft skin and is maybe not in the military, and so is sort of seen as he's not contributing to
Yes.
protection of the culture.
There's a wide range of possibilities for how to take that word in Paul's usage of it. Another point that Martin makes is that given that we don't really understand what Paul was talking about there, isn't it interesting to notice that these words occur in the midst of other bad behaviors, many of which are economic? And so what if that's the context rather than sexuality per se? So
potential human trafficking going on in some of these.
From the new RSV to new NRSVue, male prostitutes is kept the same, male prostitutes. But then there's a footnote saying, we really don't know what the word means. And then the same thing for sodomites. They do change that to men who engage in illicit sex. Meaning of Greek, uncertain. We don't know what that means either. So that's that there is a change in the second word there, but in the first word, no change. But a footnote, a helpful footnote, saying we really don't understand this completely. So it's cautionary. So I recommend scholars who've done their homework and people like Dale Martin and John Boswell. I'm tired. Have we had enough? Thank you all.
More batteries.
We'll double your pay.
Sounds good on the surface. Thank you all.